Cause, a principle, aim, or movement that because of a deep commitment, one is prepared to defend or advocate. Karibu. Karibu is a Kiswahili word that means welcome. Welcome, you found yourself in a peaceful place, a place where you can grow and develop, and we hope grow and develop to your fullest potential. The Cause Podcast is a space for you to be like George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic when they say, free your mind and your bottom will follow. This is a podcast that we hope will expand your mind and raise your consciousness. Welcome to The Cause. Conversations on music, history, and democracy. We were a musical movement which said we were women and we have freedom of speech to talk about things and sing about things that most females wouldn't dream of saying. Sarah Dash, member of the iconic Black feminist funk group, LaBelle. Welcome to this episode of the Cause Podcast. This episode's Cause today is focused on the Black women's liberation movement, and in specific, the soundtracks of the Black women's liberation movement. It will revolve around a discussion of my book, Black Women's Liberation Movement Music, subtitle, Soul Sisters, Black Feminist Funksters, and Afro Disco Divas. This book was recently named Best History in the category Best Historical Research in Recorded Blues, R&B, Gospel, Hip Hop, or Soul Music in the 2024 Association for Recorded Sound Collections Awards for Excellence. I'm so excited to share a little bit about my book, Black Women's Liberation Movement Music. Introduction. So the introduction to this book is called The Musical Icons and Anthems of the Black Women's Liberation Movement. The introduction provides an overview of the main aim of the book, which, as you might imagine, is to offer an analysis of the unique role that Black women's popular music played in the Black women's liberation movement. Conversely, the introduction also offers a preview of the impact that Black feminism and the Black women's liberation movement either directly or indirectly had on Black women's popular music during the mid to late 1960s and throughout the 1970s. The book begins with a series of simple questions, such as, what was the Black women's liberation movement? We got to start there. What was the Black women's liberation movement? How was the movement's politics and emphasis on racial, gender, and economic justice expressed through the work of African American women musicians, especially soul, funk, and disco artists? What is Black musical feminism? This is a concept I developed in the book, Black musical feminism. What were the connections between the Black musical feminism of soul, funk, and disco artists and the Black political feminism of the Black women's liberation movement? In essence, there have been studies that have explored the Black political feminism of the Black women's liberation movement, and there's been new studies that have explored, let's call it the Black literary feminism of the Black women's liberation movement. This book is distinctive. It is the first to explore the soundtracks of the Black women's liberation movement. Chapter 1, The Black Women's Liberation Movement. Prior to our protracted exploration of Black Women's Liberation Movement music, it is important to first share with readers a brief history of the Black Women's Liberation Movement. Consequently, the first chapter, which is called The Black Women's Liberation Movement, provides an abbreviated overview of the movement and its major figures. It argues that, as with any other socio-political movement, the Black Women's Liberation Movement of the 1960s and 1970s had several major objectives, organizations, activists, theorists, and themes. Questions this chapter seeks to answer include: what was the Black Women's Liberation Movement? Who were its leaders and members? What were the core concerns of the Black Women's Liberation Movement? What was its relationship to the Black Power movement? What was its relationship to the mainstream and more noted women's liberation movement? What was its relationship to the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s? In essence, you can see that I'm bringing an intersectional analysis to a history of the Black women's liberation movement. Most people talk about the mainstream women's liberation movement, which many of the Black feminists active in the 1960s and the 1970s felt that the mainstream movement centered white women, their experiences, particularly college-educated and middle-class white women, where working class and underclass women of every different racial background they felt were often left out of the equation. And once we sort of come to the experiences of African-American women, it was doubly difficult, right, to explore and to have dialogues. And so here they broke out and created their own unique movement, the Black Women's Liberation Movement, which was as preoccupied with racial justice and economic justice as it was with gender justice. Chapter 2, Black Musical Feminism. It introduces the concept of Black musical feminism, which is a framework for identifying and analyzing the long tradition of African American women's musical expressions of Black women's empowerment, a Black womenfolk and Black mother-wit informed worldview, Black womanhood, Black sisterhood, and Black women's simultaneous commitment to racial justice, gender justice, and economic justice. Here, in Chapter 2, the theory and praxis of the Black women's liberation movement will be discussed with an eye on the way it, whether directly or indirectly, influenced the tenor of Black women's soul, funk, and disco, and vice versa. The ways that Black women's soul, funk, and disco, in turn, served as a musical mouthpiece for the movement. If indeed music is more than merely music for many, if not most, African Americans, especially those actively involved in social, political, and cultural movements, when, where, why, and how the unique relationship between Black women's popular music and Black women's popular movements developed are key questions. This chapter asks and answers the questions: how was the Black women's liberation movement's politics and emphasis on racial, gender, and economic justice expressed through the work of African American women musicians, especially soul, funk, and disco artists? What is Black musical feminism? How was the Black musical feminism of the Black women's liberation movement influenced by, and how did it influence the Black arts movement and the feminist art movement? How was the Black musical feminism of the Black women's liberation movement influenced by, and how did it influence the Black aesthetic and the feminist aesthetic of the 1960s and 1970s? Chapter 3, Soul Sisters. This chapter analyzes female singers of the classic soul period between the mid 1960s and the mid 1970s. And it argues that legends like Aretha Franklin and Nina Simone created a distinct kind of cultural, social, and political expression that loosely drew from the Black Power movement and the women's liberation movement. For the most part, soul women's work dealt with many of the same topics as their soul brother and white female pop rock counterparts. However, soul sisters engaged these topics from African American women's standpoint, or their perspective, or position, or point of view. Black female soul, funk, and disco music documented the range of responses African American women had to both Black masculinist and white feminist protests in the 1960s and 1970s while communicating many of the views and values of the Black women's liberation movement. This chapter chronicles the emergence of African American women's utilization of soul as a form of musical protest and how this distinct dissent became foundational for Black women's funk and disco that followed in its wake. So we're going to talk about, in this chapter, Aretha Franklin and Nina Simone, but we also nod to Etta James and Tina Turner during the classic soul period. There's a tendency for a lot of people to talk about, let's say, Ray Charles and Sam Cooke and Otis Redding and Al Green. But during this same period, you had an explosion, a soul sister renaissance that was going on, where you have these incredible iconic figures, again, like Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone, Etta James, and Tina Turner. Chapter 4, Black Feminist Funksters. So this fourth chapter, which is called Black Feminist Funksters, challenges interpretations of funk that mostly focus on funk's major male figures, such as James Brown, Sly Stone, and George Clinton, among others. It argues that funk's major female figures, such as Maxine, Chaka Khan, and Betty Davis, among many others, are often forgotten or overlooked. The chapters explores the ways that Black women's funk frequently captured and conveyed striking aspects of a combination of the Black Power movement, the women's liberation movement, and the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s, a la the Black political feminism of the Black women's liberation movement. By using Black musical feminism as a framework, here, Black women's feminism is placed in critical dialogue with Black women's funk. Both 1970s Black feminism and Black women's funk are shown to be interconnected and important mediums that reflect the ideals and ethos of the Black women's liberation movement, primarily focusing on the work of Chaka Khan and Betty Davis, the undisputed queens of funk. The chapter emphasizes how their funk was emblematic of some of the ways Black women's popular music in the 1970s reflected significant changes in Black feminist thought taking place during the peak years of the Black women's liberation movement. There's a long tendency, we all know, for people to start and stop with the trinity, most people say, of funk music, which would be James Brown, Sly Stone, and George Clinton, Parliament Funkadelic. I seek to upend that narrative, to challenge it, to let people know, just like there are iconic male figures in funk, there are just as many. And so for me, there's a triad of LaBelle, Chaka Khan, and Betty Davis, that their work is taking on sometimes topics even broader than folks like James Brown, Sly Stone, and George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic. And so it's very important here to see this sort of emphasis on a Black feminist musicology. I know that's a mouthful, but essentially, I'm challenging the tendency in musicology to focus primarily on either white male rock icons, many of whom I have a lot of their work, or when you do say feminist musicologies, there's a tendency to focus primarily on white women. So it's really important to see here that with this concept of Black musical feminism, there's a challenge to not simply those people that are working in Black popular music studies, but also Black protest movement studies. What if part of the thesis here is that what makes African American movements, social and political movements, so unique, they all have soundtracks. Whether we go back to the abolitionist movement, which the soundtrack of that movement was the spirituals, or the so-called New Negro movement, the soundtrack was simultaneously the blues initially, but also jazz. We all know F. Scott Fitzgerald came out with a book in 1926 called Tales from the Jazz Age. And that's how the 1920s and going into the 1930s got that moniker, that era, the Jazz Age, because of F. Scott Fitzgerald. So here's this an iconic white American writer who was influenced by Black popular music. By the time we fast forward to the civil rights movement, obviously rhythm and blues and rock and roll were the secular soundtracks of the civil rights movement. But I would also like to pay homage to the sacred soundtracks of the civil rights movement, gospel, and freedom songs. So it's really, really important to understand the uniqueness of the ways that African Americans develop protest movements. They also have protest music soundtracks. Little factoid, something unique about Black popular movements. Black popular movements are connected to Black popular music.
Are you ready to dive deep into the rich histories, cultures, and arts of Africa and the African diaspora? At the Center for African and African American Studies, affectionately known as The Cause, we're leading the way in research, arts, and student engagement at the University of Colorado, Boulder. The Cause is more than just a research center. It's a space where students, faculty, artists, allies, and activists come together to explore African and African American experiences, from historical legacies to modern cultural expressions. And at the heart of it all, our students, playing a central role in everything we do. They're the future of this important cultural legacy, working side by side with faculty on groundbreaking projects and events that impact not just the campus, but the community and wider world. Research projects and events that impact not just our beloved CU campus, but the community and world at large.
Our mission? To foster academic excellence, social responsibility, and artistic expression, with programs that inspire leadership and advocacy for social justice. Whether you're interested in visual arts, music, or deepening your understanding of African American culture, The Cause is the place for you.
But we can't do it alone. The Cause relies on the generous support of our community to continue making a difference. By giving to the Center for African and African American Studies, you help us expand research, create opportunities for artists, support our students, and drive meaningful social change. And right now, your gift will go even further. All donations will be matched by CU Boulder Chancellor Justin Swartz for up to $1 million or until May 30th, 2026. To make your impact today, visit colorado.edu/center/cause and click on Support the Cause. Every contribution, large or small, brings us closer to a future of unity, knowledge, and transformation.
So, if you're looking for a community where history, culture, and creativity converge, visit the Center for African and African American Studies at CU Boulder. Come join the cause and be a part of a movement for unity, knowledge, and social change.
Learn more and give today at colorado.edu/center/cause. We can't wait to welcome you to the cause.
Chapter 5, so this 5th chapter, is called Afro Disco Divas. It offers an exploration of Black women's disco music and the ways it reflected Black women's rejection of the Black nationalist masculinism of the Black Power movement, the politics of respectability, and embrace of the sexual revolution of the 1970s. Similar to, if not even more than, classic funk, disco enabled African American women to publicly express their sexual pleasures and desires. With its celebration of sexuality, among other things, disco offered Black women a platform with which they could unambiguously sing about sexual subjects that has previously, for the most part, been buried beneath much lyrical innuendo. Centering on Black disco divas' rejection of the Black nationalist masculinism of the Black Power movement and the politics of respectability, as well as their powerful public expressions of their sexual pleasures and desires. The concluding chapter argues that select Afro-disco divas such as Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor, Diana Ross, and Grace Jones communicated several of the core characteristics of the sexual politics of the Black women's liberation movement during its final years between 1977 and 1979. In many ways, the book ends, much like it began, by emphasizing that a distinct form of Black musical feminism emerged out of and provided a fascinating soundtrack for the Black women's liberation movement. It was really important in the Afro Disco Divas chapter to apply queer musicology to this chapter. And so that's something that really sort of gave this chapter a twist to do sort of Black queer musicology. And even though we're talking about mostly, women who would be identified as straight women like Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor, Diana Ross, and Grace Jones, there was something about the way this music was able to translate to the queer community and the trans community of the late 1970s. So Donna Summer singing Hot Stuff, Baby This Evening. You know what I'm saying? Gloria Gaynor singing I Will Survive. It shows the universality of a lot of African American women's musical expressions and identities. So a lot of people can relate to I Will Survive. When Diana Ross sings, I'm coming out and I want the world to know I'm got it. Wow. I mean, literally, this is a soundtrack for so many queer folks coming out, if you will, during that time. And what can we say about Grace Jones, who has a song called Slave to the Rhythm, right? So they said like to put on that disco beat. Wow, that some people would just lose hours of their life dancing in the club. They could finally have a space where they could live out loud. And even though these were women singing these songs, lots of white and BIPOC queer men idolized Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor, Diana Ross, and Grace Jones. And so now we finally made it to the end of the book, Black Women's Liberation Movement Music. The conclusion. The conclusion emphasizes that while there have been books focused on Black political feminism and the Black literary feminism of the Black women's liberation movement, rarely have the respective soundtracks of the movement been discussed in relationship to and as musical reflections of the core principles of the movement. Within the worlds of both Black popular movement studies and Black popular music studies, there has been a long-standing tendency to almost exclusively associate Black women's music of the 1960s and 1970s with the Black male-dominated Black Power movement or the white female-dominated women's liberation movement. However, this book ends by emphasizing that much of the soul, funk, and disco performed by Black women was most often the very popular music of a very unpopular and unsung movement, the Black women's liberation movement. I get asked all the time, why devote a whole book to African-American women's music in the 1960s and the 1970s? And this is a passion project. This is something I feel very strongly about. I believe that there are a lot of music scholars, a lot of music critics, a lot of music historians, a lot of musicologists who are writing about the same topics over and over and over again. This is about turning your attention to some of the forgotten, some of the folks that have been rendered invisible and erased. That's one of my great causes, is to give you some alternative knowledge, to share some alternative herstory, some alternative conceptions of who we are, how we are, who we have been, who we have the potential to become. And so emphasizing that a lot of us, whether we are Black women or not, we draw a lot of inspiration from this music. And even if it's not this music from the 60s and the 70s, I don't know if you can listen to Erykah Badu and not think about Chaka Khan. I don't know if you can listen to Michelle Ndigio-Cello or Lauryn Hill or Alicia Keys or Jill Scott or Georgia Ann Muldrow. I don't know if you can listen to contemporary African-American women's music and not connect that music to Black musical herstory. And it's not just Black women. I don't know anybody that can listen to Pink or Nelly Furtado or Christina Aguilera or even Britney Spears. I said it, even Britney Spears and Katy Perry and them. I don't really know if we are fully appreciating the significant contributions African-American women have made to American music history and American music culture. This book is a contribution to an alternative music herstory of American music. Holla at me. Here we go. We've reached the part of the program, the breakdown, which is where we recommend some books, some films, but most often, some music. So today, for this special breakdown, let's start with Aretha Franklin. Let's start with those soul sisters, Aretha Franklin. If you really, want to know, most people associate Aretha Franklin with love songs, and they overlook her incredible protest songs. So I want you to think about this. Aretha Franklin's protest music, go back and get a track called Hard Times. Listen to her sing Billie Holiday's God Bless the Child, right? She's doing this during the height of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement. So God bless the child. I almost be God bless the black child. Y'all better stop me. I'm about to get started. Aretha Franklin singing Nobody Knows the Way I Feel This Morning. She also sang a song, If I Had a Hammer. She sang her contemporary Sam Cooke's song. After he passed, she sang a version of A Change Is Gonna Come. She also sang the civil rights movement anthem, I Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Round. She sang Curtis Mayfield's People Get Ready, Son of a Preacher Man. When the Battle Is Over, she sang an incredible version of Young, Gifted, and Black. In fact, Aretha Franklin's 1972 album was called Young, Gifted, and Black. And that album was so popular in 1972, it achieved the Grammy Award. She also sung Border Song, Holy Moses, Bridge Over Troubled Water, and many of us would argue that she created an incredible protest album with her iconic album, Amazing Grace, showing the relationship between gospel and soul music. Aretha Franklin. We can go from Aretha Franklin to the incredible work of the person that is called the high priestess of soul. That would be Nina Simone. Anybody who really wants to hear some music, you've got to go and pick up these albums where Nina Simone, much like Meshell Ndegeocello, had the ability to blur the lines between blues, jazz, folk, soul, rock, gospel. And so I'd like to recommend these albums. Go back and get the very Bob Dylan influenced album, Folksy Nina from 1964. Folksy Nina, it will blow your mind. The record company, of course, wanted her to sell some records, so her next album was called Broadway Blues and Ballads, 1964. These are albums. After that, she did an album, one of my favorites. It's called Pastel Blues. That's from 1965. And then my absolute favorite, Nina Simone album, where she does both love songs and protest songs. So that's one of the things about all of this music I'm recommending. Again, simultaneously love songs, but also protest songs, understanding that African-American women's musicians, their protests might sound very different than men's protests. We need to allot for that. We need to open our ears to the unique ways in which sisters protest. Some people only associate Nina Simone with jazz. And I think that she was signaling with this particular album, The High Priestess of Soul in 1967, that she was as much a soul sister as much as she was a jazz chanteuse, meaning, of course, a jazz songstress. I'm just giving you some $5 words. You said that you wanted to come to class with me. Another one of my favorite albums by Nina Simone is Nina Simone Sings the Blues. This is from 1967. It is phenomenal, and it features lyrics by Langston Hughes, who passed away that year. So she was very, very close with literary figures. And of course, I can shout out here, some people already know this, my favorite volume of verse by Langston Hughes came out in 1926, and it's called The Weary Blues. And everybody knows Langston Hughes was one of the very first American poets to couple poetry with American music. The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes, 1926. Friend of Nina Simone. My last recommendation for Nina Simone is called Nina Simone and Piano from 1968. It's an incredible album because it is in response to Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination on April the 4th, 1968. And so again, this is how the music reflects so much more than music. It's not simply aesthetics, but it's also politics. So after the Soul Sister recommendations, I have a couple of recommendations for Black feminist funk. Now, this is something I am a fanatic about, so I'm trying not to take you down the rabbit hole that I've been stuck in for for way too long. Obviously, the queen of commercial funk music, Chaka Khan. If you want to really hear some music, listen to a record called Tell Me Something Good by Chaka Khan. That was written specifically for Chaka Khan by Stevie Wonder. So Stevie Wonder is the composer and producer of that song. He wrote it specifically for Chaka Khan. After that, pick up or listen to a song called I'm a Woman, I'm a Backbone. I'm a Woman, I'm a Backbone by Chaka Khan. And then certainly the most incredible, literally the song that became the anthem for the end of the Black women's liberation movement, I'm Every Woman. I'm Every Woman by Chaka Khan. That came out in 1979. So the very last year, some people say, of the women's liberation movement. And I want to point out that I'm Every Woman was not simply the anthem of the Black women's liberation movement. No, it was adopted as the anthem for the women's liberation movement, right? Women all over the world identified with Shaka Khan's I'm Every Woman. We go from Shaka Khan to Betty Davis. And if you want to hear some real music, I'm going to just rattle these off the top of my head really quick. Go and get Betty Davis's debut album. Some of y'all already know that Betty Davis was Miles Davis's wife for a year. And Miles Davis, his wedding present to his beloved bride was called BITCH's Brew. BITCH's Brew, just in case my mother listens to this. I don't want to be cussing folks out. I came to bless you and not cuss you. And so it was Betty Davis who exposed Miles Davis to the music of James Brown, Jimi Hendrix, Sly Stone. So sometimes she don't get the credit that she really deserves, but she was a incredible Black feminist funk singer-songwriter in her own right. Please go back and get her debut album called Betty Davis. After she came out with an album called Betty Davis, she came out with an album called They Say I'm Different. You got to hear this music. And then lastly, please pick up her album called Nasty Gal. Nasty Gal. So her music was so sensational. It was so provocative that it was not simply condemned by conservatives, but even the NAACP banned her music, had her music censored on various radio stations, and sadly, even many women's libbers rejected her music and had it censored as well. This is how provocative the music of Betty Davis is. So the Afro Disco Divas recommendations, we know that there are a lot of people who run around making fun of disco music. They still run around saying disco sucks, but those people, they've never danced to disco in one of these sweaty clubs and really felt like the DJ saved your life by playing that particular track. So first and foremost, you've got to get Donna Summer's Love to Love You, Baby. You've got to get Donna Summer's Hot Stuff, Baby, this evening. You've got to get Donna Summer's Bad Girls, and she's talking about sex workers at this time, which was very, very controversial. So her and Betty Davis both sang about sex workers, but Betty Davis was censored where Donna Summer ended up getting a Grammy. Just think about that. From there, we go to Gloria Gaynor. Obviously, we can start and stop with I Will Survive, which becomes an anthem not simply for the women's liberation movement, but also the queer movement. And certainly as we move from the late 1970s into the 1980s and the explosion of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, I Will Survive was repurposed as one of the anthems for AIDS awareness. I Will Survive. From there, we go to an iconic artist like Diana Ross. Obviously, her song, I'm Coming Out, registered, but there were so many of her songs in the 1970s. I mean, we also know that she was considered the queen of Motown, much to the chagrin of several of the divas around Motown, like Martha Reeves, right? And Gladys Knight, with and without the pips, if you will. And then from there, obviously, somebody who really embodies a kind of Black bohemia, Grace Jones, with all of her iconic, incredible blurring of the lines in so many different ways. But go and get a track called Slave to the Rhythm. I mean, something she says that basically that disco beat, that disco rhythm just takes her away. She gets swept up in that pulsation, right? And for her, she talks about how orgasmic that beat and that music is for her. So again, there's this kind of like realize this music also becomes a soundtrack to the sexual revolution of the 1970s. So there you have it. That's the breakdown. That's some of the recommendations that we have for you. There are so many documentaries, some of them better than others, on disco that I could recommend as well. But here are some of the soundtracks, some of the music that would coincide with this new book, Black Women's Liberation Movement Music. If you liked learning about the Black Women's Liberation Movement and its soundtracks, and you have something special that you want to say about this particular episode or any of our other episodes, please contact us. Reach out to us. We want your letters. We want your comments. We want your questions. This is a very democratic podcast. So we want some deep dialogue and high quality conversation going on in every episode. Get in touch with us at thecause@gmail.com. I repeat, thecause@gmail.com. And my producer has me repeating this one more time just because he's so funky. What's up, Jay? THECAAAS@gmail.com. Holla at us. Well, please don't really holler at us. We got enough people doing that. Actually, love on us. How about that? Send us some love letters, some funky love letters. Here's some instructions. Y'all know I be making fun of my students in my classes. You're not following directions, right? You're not listening to the instructions. Here we go. I want you to go out there and listen to some Aretha Franklin. Listen to Nina Simone, to Chaka Khan, to Betty Davis, to Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor, Diana Ross, Grace Jones. We're actually providing a playlist for you on our website. It's that simple. We're not asking you to do a bunch of homework, to go do a bunch of crate digging. No, that's what my fabulous producer, that's his job. That's what he's doing. He's already done the work for you. All you have to do is sit your bottom down or stand it up, because, we do need to work out, Boulder. We all lean out here. I love this little city, right? So all you have to do is just press play on this playlist that we have that is simply, it's like a companion to the book. My producer, John Arnold, has compiled a playlist for you. I want you to listen to this and see if you can't hear an alternate herstory. I'm saying it, not his story, an alternate herstory of American music and American musical culture. I want you to see the ways in which these sisters protest. And it may not be James Brown saying, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud" in 1968, but in their own unique ways. Black musical feminist protest, it's still protest. And if I can sort of nod to Betty Davis says that she don't sing love songs. She sings anti-love songs. She said it's a real pitfall and a problem for women to idealize relationships in a patriarchal society. She said women should have just as much power in their relationships with men as they do anywhere else. So not love songs, but anti-love songs and musical protest. How does that look? How does that sound? And how has that informed the work of Mary J. Blige, of Erykah Badu, of Rhapsody, right? Of Nicki Minaj and Cardi B. I could do this, of No Name. I could do this all day, but we ain't got all day, right? I gotta wrap this thing up. But the call to action, this music will help you wake up, right? And stay awake. Keep listening, keep the music. And again, welcome to the Cause Podcast. We see y'all later.
Thank you for joining us for the Cause Podcast with Dr. Raylan Rabaka. If you'd like to contact Dr. Rabaka or the Center for African and African American Studies, email cause, CAAAS, @colorado.edu. For your letters, questions, and suggestions regarding the podcast, email us, thecause@gmail.com, CAAAS. We may even read your letter on the air. The Cause Podcast with Dr. Raylan Rabaka is produced and edited by John Arnold and is a production of the Center for African and African American Studies, The Cause, at the University of Colorado Boulder. For more information, visit us online at colorado.edu/center/cause, CAAAS.
Class is in session, so come and get your lesson. Ooh, the Cause Podcast. I love that. Do you love that?